This tour. It was all so fucking hilarious. Really, it was. Even before Southern and Molyneux got here, the laughs had started. In the weeks leading up to the tour, the promoters were calling a group devoted explicitly to non-violent protests in the form of yelling terrorists. Now that was just one judgment, notable among other great gaffes, like flat out stating that cops were in danger of being sent to gulags for upholding the law. That's not even paraphrasing, by the way. Check out the links below if you haven't seen these mock-up vids from Yard already. For a bit there, it even looked like Southern wouldn't even make it after her visa application got denied. Immigration here has since said that it was more about giving her the appropriate visa for a little visit than anything else. But meh, the good bit here was the reaction of Southern's camp, who got on sooking about the denial being an apparent decision to deny Southern her freedom of speech. Cause you know, we can control our borders when it comes to denying brown people their right to seek asylum, but we can't control our borders when it comes to denying one Canadian, out of two, the right to come here and, well, spread racism. Whatevers though, they got their visas, both Southern and Molyneux made it over, and the laughs only ratcheted up. The first event of note upon arrival, for me anyway, was when Lauren went for a walk around Melbourne, asking random people if we should kill her. She was met almost exclusively with either jokes or ignorance of who she even was. There was also this.
How should we kill her?
Oh geez, I don't know, like in front of a tram, I don't know.
In front of a tram?
Like it wasn't our fault.
Very good. That's very sneaky. That's very sneaky.
Because we're not for killing, but...
We're not for killing.
You know, it could happen in another way.
It could happen accidentally.
This city is weird. The Melbourne event itself soon then rolled around, and organisers' efforts to avoid protesters by busing their audience to the venue failed miserably. Now this meant that they copped a massive bill from police, which they also had a bit of a moan about. I would too, I guess. But the thing is, they probably knew it was coming in the event that they couldn't avoid the counter demo. I called up VicPol to ask how this works, and they said that those fees are only charged in the event that organisers sign documents and agree to security plans, including given fees for a given deployment. So what can I say? I don't feel sorry for you that you tried to save money at your paid-for racist event and failed. Honestly found that pretty funny. The tour then left Melbourne and went to Adelaide, where in standard Adelaide fashion things were smaller but also just as awesome. Here, Lauren, when asked why she's a quote racist dog, asked for evidence to show that she was indeed racist, which is just classic because she might as well have asked for evidence that she's a blonde. On to Sydney then, where we saw the best of it, starting when Lauren again decided that it was a good idea to take her show to the street, this time to make her way to Lakemba. While there, a few things happened, but the favourite bit was after she claimed that the area was very monocultured when speaking to a passerby who stopped to talk. The passerby, who it turns out is the News Corp crime reporter for the area, of all people, pointed out that there were restaurants nearby that were Pakistani and Indian. A beautiful example of successful multiculturalism, one might think, given the history of those two cultures. But no, clarified Southern, before asking where the British pubs were, because you know, she's not a racist, it's just that multiculturalism doesn't count if it doesn't include the dominant culture that is pretty much everywhere in Australia. As it turns out, it's also present in this section of Lakemba anyway, because we then got this gem.
Many British pubs in this area? There's one right there. Where? The Lakemba Hotel, it's right there.
Soon after that exchange, Southern was asked to leave the area by police, who were concerned that she would breach the peace. Southern claimed that this proved that the area was under Sharia law and a no-go zone. Because of course, areas run by a fundamentalist version of Sharia would allow the service of alcohol. I fucking love it. So yeah, up to and including that spot in the timeline, I'd been finding it all to be pretty much the height of comedy. It was great. That night though, things took a big old U-turn. They had their event in Sydney, and a champion bloke named Simon Copland live tweeted the whole thing. Now just picture me, sitting at home on my couch, painting my nails and eating tofu like normal of course, and feeling that warm inner glow that comes from being on the right side of history. I'm flicking through Twitter, and up it pops. Stefan Molyneux has told his audience, to resounding cheers no less, that the invasion of Australia was about stopping infanticide and rape. All sense of joviality was gone from me in the time it would take you to snap your fingers, and the illusion that we were getting through this by simply poking fun was shattered. Yeah, the stuff said at this event was violent and incorrect, which would be obviously bad enough, but for me personally, the biggest thing was that it was suddenly in stark relief that there is an audience out there in this country that is highly receptive to this crap. This is something that I was aware of course, they sold many a ticket etc, but I guess until that moment I've been able to push it to the back of my mind. I mean, why dwell on the response of the audience when you can laugh at the awkward photos they took? Well, as I was narratively now acutely aware, because they eat this shit up anyway, and it is bloody serious business. That audience goes away from these events carrying that message with them, and we know that shit can spread very effectively in this country. We don't need to look past Pauline fucking Hanson being again an elected official to understand that. When the stakes are this high, we should be doing away with humour or parody. Salute to one of the most genius satires of all time, Pauline Pansdown, as a given here, by the way. But I'm still convinced that as part of our response to this, the counter-narrative needs to be set up. It needs to be strong, and it needs to be repeated often. And that's fine too, because while my perception at least is that we're better at humour on the whole than those across the aisle, we're also absolutely in possession of the facts. It takes a bit more effort to do it like this, it's not as much fun, but we need to be willing. So, now that that little story come justification is out of the way, the rest of this is going to be a response to the worser and more definite things that Molyneux had to say as per the live tweeting. Couple of quick qualifiers before we go on though, I'm sorry but I think they're needed. I am going to try very hard not to simply repeat the very valid points Copland has already made in tweeting this stuff out. In some places though, I'll be pretty much expanding on what he's already said to try and drive the point home. Really, but most of the credit here should go to Copland anyway, he did the real work here. So whatever happens, go follow him on Twitter and that, he's got lots of good stuff to say about lots of topics. Aside from that point, I am also aware that Molyneux has stated his plan to publish his views on Indigenous Australians, or as we should be calling them, the sovereign owners of the land we now call Australia, in an essay. You better believe that if that happens, I'll be fact-checking that shit in severe detail, which will be great fun for everyone, I'm sure. I'm also planning on doing a follow-up vid about the things he's had to say on IQ recently, just FYI. But for now, this is what you're getting, so let's do it. First bit, Molyneux reportedly mocked Indigenous mythology. Now, which exact part or aspect of these myths he was mocking, I don't know, of course, wasn't there for one. As well, the stories and beliefs vary across the different groups that make up Indigenous culture in Australia. And it's only initiated elders who know all the stories anyway. They don't share those readily. But it still begs a clear point, I think. I can't find an instance of Molyneux approaching the Christian myths with anything that could be called mockery. In fact, his approach to the concept of Christianity, despite his reportedly becoming an atheist since his youth, seems positively respectful, which would be fine of course if it wasn't so hypocritical. Example, in the video pictured, he discusses his reasons for leaving his religion, and notably missing is doubt of the myths of Christ or the Bible, let alone mockery of them. Instead, the sermon here boils down to what is represented in his statement that Christians are not good enough for Christ. He reports that his decision to leave Christianity had basically everything to do with recognising the moral failings of some Christians, and that's it. No mention at all of the creation myths or myths in general that really are essential to that religion. And those Christian myths are just as bizarre as anything else out there. Surely this isn't something I need to describe to a YouTube audience, but I mean in this very video there is discussion of speaking in tongues and heaven and hell. Molyneux doesn't mock that idea or anything close to it, he just kinda nods along. He even says he's unsure of the source of his religious experiences and describes himself as having felt the God glow. So yeah, what makes the Indigenous myths so bizarre that they're worthy of mockery, but the Christian myths so much less so? Well, I think I know to be honest, and I think you do too. I'll leave this one there. Second bit, this lovely sentence. They say that your ancestors tried to steal the land. I say that they were trying to stop infanticide and mass rape. I will not honour this culture. For an apparent historian, this guy doesn't seem to know fuck all. Now apologies, this section is likely to not only be basic as fuck, but for the Australians among us, it'll pretty much consist of things we learned very early on in our education. Molyneux didn't have that luxury, I guess. Anyway, this continent was originally declared terra nullius by Captain Cook when he and his first fleet arrived here, and claimed it for Britain. Terra nullius means no one's land, and in declaring it as such, they were declaring that it was uninhabited. Now this was a decision taken in part because Cook and his men saw very little in the way of natives. They did see some, but not many, and this was seen as a real plus. As noted in Martin Crotty's book, The Great Mistakes of Australian History, the journal of Joseph Banks, a scientist sailing with Cook, reads in relation to Australia. It is an immense tract of land, considerably larger than all of Europe, thinly inhabited even to admiration. The British Empire, as a colonial power, wanted land. The fact that they assumed, wrongly as it turned out, that there were only a few inhabitants living near the coast was seen as a major plus for the concept of a colony on this continent. Fewer natives meant less trouble in taking the place over. I mean, it's not like they saw the few natives that they did and think, oh well, it's only a few, but at least we can save them from themselves. It's only a handful, but we've got them. The same book also notes that there was some consternation around the Indigenous people from what I guess constitutes a group of 1700 social justice warriors, but it was not about these Indigenous who apparently needed saving from themselves. The concern was about the impact that settlement would have upon Aboriginals by way of the settlers being chiefly staffed by convicts, who were expected to be a pretty nasty bunch. Now, according to the book, it is only after this potential issue is raised that the arguments about the benefits to the natives of being colonised comes up. This no, it will be good for them actually idea was developed as a counter-narrative to the concerns people held for the original inhabitants of Australia, and it was developed by people who wanted the colony to go ahead. It had nothing to do with altruism. There was no group under their own steam, at first anyway, going, well, we better get over there and save them, chaps. I know it's going to be tough and a drain on resources, but these people we've seen next to nothing of probably have a really high infant mortality rate. Like shit. Even Cook noted of the inhabitants that he did see, they seemed far happier than we Europeans. Yeah, this whole line is bullshit. And look, I'm not even of the opinion that the British had nothing to offer. I'm not even of the opinion that the Indigenous represented something like a perfect culture. But that's not the issue here. The issue is actually twofold in this instance. It's thinking or pretending that any of what has happened to Indigenous Australians since colonisation justifies the practice, and also that expanding the empire wasn't the motivating factor behind what happened. This speaks to the concept of honouring Indigenous culture as well. Fine, don't honour it, but you don't get to skate on your concept of superiority when the arrival of the culture you promote above all others resulted in, well, this. Third thing, Aborigines had Australia for 40,000 years. You have had it for a tiny fraction of that time, and look what you have done. And you're supposed to feel guilty about this. First thing, 40,000 years is an older figure. Depending on evidence type, there are a few more up-to-date estimates for how long we can maybe show that Indigenous Australians have been here. The oldest one is actually 125,000 years, published in this paper here. Anyway, not the point. The main issues here are the suggestion that comparative achievements put those descended from post-British invasion migrants in a much higher stead, and the question of guilt. So as far as comparative achievements go, well, the concept is almost vague enough to ignore. Like, this really just comes down to subjectivity. But at the same time, it is something that has been levelled at many native peoples to diminish and devalue them since colonisation was a thing. So it probably can't be ignored as a result. And really, the accusation is pretty baseless anyway. Sure, Indigenous Australians didn't possess much in the way of technology recognisable to the colonisers. The Industrial Revolution and relative isolation can explain that. But there were aspects of Indigenous practice that were highly sophisticated and reflective of a complex understanding of the land they lived on, and its finite ability to support them. As an example, the Indigenous knowledge of weather and climate is recognised in this paper as being in-depth, complex and valuable enough to be used to contribute to datasets in this new modern age. Just one example there, there's plenty more if you want to look. As well, this is a culture that managed to survive here, sustainably, for at least tens of thousands of years. And in that at least, they appear to have exceeded the inheritors of the invasion. Theirs is a culture that deserves respect, which is a thing that goes both ways, if it goes at all. Now the question of guilt, honestly, I don't hear anyone saying white people or anyone else should feel guilty for their being born into a situation. If such people exist, they will be few and far between, because it would be unfair and pretty illogical to hold descendants of colonisers to account for the sins of said colonisers. But I think Molyneux, like so many others, has missed the point here, deliberately or otherwise. If there is any guilt to be had, it is in the sort of scenario where you say deny the past, or reduce the validity and value of entire peoples. You may even, in such circumstances, do things like place blame on the Indigenous people for the situation they have found themselves in post-colonisation. If that's the sort of thing you engage in, yeah, you should feel guilty for that, because that's you being a douche. Point 4. Bit of an amalgamation here, but essentially, Indigenous Australians were violent and killed off those who broke the rules. Now this is just lazy, so I'm going to be lazy right back. Because, isn't it great to come from the amorphous set of cultures that these pundits are calling the West? Because they never engaged in violence. Never ever. Nor has this mythical West ever engaged in use of the death penalty for lawbreakers. Past or present. Point 5. We're getting close to the end now, I promise. Yeah, point 5. The Indigenous people believed they couldn't alter the land, which is why they didn't have agriculture. Now this is just flat wrong. There is evidence of Indigenous agriculture, aquaculture even. They also altered and managed the land using controlled burning, which is a practice being reinstated today to help with management of Australian savanna. So good job on the research there, Stefan. I can't wait for this essay. Alright, so we're at the last part, which is a relief for everyone, believe me. But what I'm doing here is again combining a few comments and looking at them all together. These are: Australia is the only place that doesn't have a treaty with Indigenous people because you couldn't, because Aboriginal people were at the lowest rung of civilization. Okay? And I want you to remember that great evils were halted with the advent of whites to Australia, as great evils were halted with the advent of whites to South Africa. Jesus fucking Christ. Alright, lastly, we in the West have extended ethics beyond the in-group. That's why we have human rights. That's why we ended slavery, and that's why we extended rights to minority groups. We're the only culture to have done that. Other cultures are not universalist, but we are. Right. I'm ignoring a lot I could bring up here, because frankly I'm sick of this. But is the conflict in this not blindingly obvious to people? Stefan has just given a lecture on how Indigenous Australians were the lowest of the low, which is why they couldn't and cannot expect a treaty, which would in fact protect their rights. But then somehow the West is respectful of the rights of other groups. Cognitive dissonance aside, this really chaps my ass. How do you think you're going to do everything you can to devalue a whole race and culture, then legitimise the colonisation by pretending that it was in the best interests of the original inhabitants, and then say the West, which you represent, is the universalist saviours? It would be bad enough if this was being done by accident, but this bloke apparently has a master's in history. He should and probably does know better. So look, sorry Stefan, there's a lot good about the cultures you want to celebrate above all others. That amorphous and poorly defined thing we call the West does have some great things to contribute to the rest of the world, if it's done in the right way. But you, old mate, are not one of them. Thoughts, comments and corrections from the well-intentioned are always welcome. This was Yeah Nah. Thanks for listening.